Throughout most of history, fighting wars was violent and bloody, but here's the thing, it didn't cost much. I'm not talking about the moral price. I'm talking about the actual logistics. Your army? Just men who were already there? Their weapons? Mostly stuff they already had lying around. Battles happened during certain seasons, didn't last long, and were limited by where you could actually go and what you could eat. Kings didn't need financial experts to go to war. What they needed was people who were loyal, some horses, and the right timing. But then something happened that flipped everything upside down. Gunpowder. It didn't just make war deadlier, it made war ridiculously expensive. And the moment fighting became about money, it stopped being about bravery and started being about who had the deepest pockets. Welcome to a place where cash, control, and the past all crash into each other, and trust me, nothing is ever straightforward. Before gunpowder showed up, nobody had all the power in one place. Medieval Europe was like a crazy quilt of local rulers, knights who served them, and a bunch of complicated promises between them. Armies weren't permanent. Farmers got called up, did some fighting, then went back home to take care of their crops. Knights bought their own armor. Castles were built to protect, not to expand territory. War had built-in limits because it depended on regular people who still had lives to live. No kingdom's treasure chest could fund never-ending battles, and honestly, it didn't need to. If a king got too greedy and pushed too hard, his army would just fall apart. The food would run out. People would stop being loyal. The whole system kept things in check without needing any official rules. Then gunpowder showed up in Europe. At first, nobody really noticed. It came in quietly during the later medieval period. In the beginning, it didn't look like much. Those early cannons? Total junk. They broke down all the time. The first guns were painfully slow and couldn't hit anything accurately. The rich and powerful laughed them off as loud toys. But they were completely wrong, just not for the obvious reasons. Gunpowder didn't change everything because it could kill knights. It changed everything because it killed the idea of cheap warfare. Cannons completely transformed how sieges worked, and I mean overnight. Those massive stone walls that had kept cities safe for hundreds of years, they crumbled like cookies under constant cannon fire. Fortifications had to be completely reimagined. They needed to be thicker, built lower to the ground, and angled differently. And all of that meant you needed engineers, raw materials, lots of time, and tons of money. Firearms transformed how armies worked too. Training someone to be a knight? That took their entire life. Training someone to use a musket? A few months. But only if you had enough money to buy the weapons, the gunpowder, set up the supply lines, and keep everything restocked constantly. Battles weren't about what your soldiers could carry anymore. They were about what your country could ship to where the fighting was happening. War stopped being a local thing. It became like running a factory. Standing armies replaced the old system where lords would call up their people. Soldiers weren't part-time fighters who farmed the rest of the year anymore. They were full-time professionals who needed paychecks all year long. Armies didn't dissolve when the campaign ended anymore. They stuck around, kept training, kept eating up resources even when there was peace. Winning didn't go to the bravest warriors anymore. It went to whoever could keep writing checks. This was the turning point when power started gathering in one place. Small-time lords couldn't afford cannons. Tiny kingdoms couldn't keep up fortresses anymore. Those old feudal deals where people owed service, that wasn't enough to pay for constant war. Only big, centralized governments with steady income could survive in this new world. Gunpowder didn't just knock down castle walls, it knocked down the whole decentralized system. And once rulers figured out that war now meant needing serious money, they ran into a new headache. Where would they get it? One-time taxes weren't cutting it. Emergency money grabs couldn't keep permanent armies going. So governments did something pretty radical. They made taxes normal and constant. What used to be occasional became the new everyday reality. What used to be negotiable became expected. People didn't just owe their loyalty anymore. They owed cold, hard cash, but even that wasn't enough. These gunpowder wars were massive, dragged on forever, and never seemed to stop. The price tag for cannons, gunpowder, fortifications, warships, and soldiers was way more than taxes alone could cover. So governments started borrowing money. This is where finance really enters the picture. Countries started issuing debt not as a desperate last move, but as their main strategy. Bonds paid for wars, credit became a weapon just like guns and cannons. Bankers and money people replaced nobles as the most important people surrounding the king. A ruler who could borrow money could keep fighting longer than one who couldn't, even if everyone liked the other guy more. War stopped being limited by how many people you had. Now it was only limited by how much credit you could get. And that changed absolutely everything. Once wars could be funded through finance, they could go on way longer than the public would normally tolerate. The costs could be stretched out over decades. Losses could be pushed off into the future. Inflation could quietly eat away part of the burden. You could mobilize entire populations financially without them ever setting foot on a battlefield. This is where the modern government was born. Permanent taxes, armies that never disbanded, public debt. Power concentrated at the top. None of this came from some philosopher's theory. It was invented because gunpowder made fighting wars the old way impossibly expensive. The human cost of this transformation was absolutely massive. Farmers paid more in taxes. Their wages couldn't keep up with rising prices. Inflation ate away their savings. Debts outlived the kings who created them and got dumped on generations who never even voted for the war, or weren't even alive when it happened. And yet the system kept going. Why? Because it worked. Gunpowder rewired how much war actually cost. And in doing that, it permanently rewired the relationship between money and power. Once gunpowder turned warfare into an ongoing expense that never stopped, governments hit a wall they'd never really faced before at this level. They couldn't afford it through honest means. Raising taxes high enough to cover standing armies, fortifications, naval fleets, and endless supply lines would spark rebellions. Borrowing huge amounts risked the government going broke. And cutting military spending meant falling behind your enemies who were still pumping money into firepower. So governments got creative. They changed how people actually felt the cost of war. This is where inflation becomes part of the story. Not by accident and not as some modern thing, but as a direct response to this gunpowder-driven economy. Inflation had been around for ages. Ancient rulers would shave coins or reduce the silver in them to survive emergencies. But those times were risky, short, and super obvious. Push it too far and trust evaporated instantly. Soldiers would refuse their pay, markets would freeze up. Governments would collapse. Gunpowder warfare changed the math completely. When war became permanent, governments needed a way to spread the cost quietly, gradually, and onto people who might never see any fighting. Inflation did exactly that. Instead of taking value directly through taxes, governments could take it indirectly by changing what money was actually worth. Instead of demanding more from citizens right now, they could demand less from their money later. The burden didn't vanish. It just dissolved into the background. This is the crucial change. Before gunpowder, inflation solved emergencies. After gunpowder, inflation helped manage the whole system. Gunpowder wars weren't quick shocks. They were long, constant drains. Cannons didn't just need to be built once. They needed constant replacement. Gunpowder went bad. Weapons broke down. Fortresses needed upkeep even during peacetime. Armies burned through resources every single day they existed. Taxes alone couldn't handle it. Debt filled the gap. But debt created its own problem. You eventually have to pay it back. Inflation quietly solved that issue too. When prices go up, the real value of debt goes down. Governments learn it slowly at first. Then, very deliberately, that a little bit of inflation reduced the weight of old wars without forcing them to officially default. Creditors got repaid the amount they were promised, but with money that couldn't buy as much anymore. The political backlash stayed quiet. Most people couldn't even see how it worked. War, funded this way, became something society could actually survive. This is why inflation becomes a constant feature in gunpowder-era governments. Not the crazy, explosive kind. Not hyperinflation that still destroys countries, but steady erosion. Just enough to release pressure? Just enough to buy more time? Just enough to keep everything running. And once this logic takes hold, it doesn't stay limited to war. Military spending becomes a permanent fixture. Debt keeps rolling forward. Inflation becomes tolerated, even expected. Financial systems evolve to manage these pressures instead of getting rid of them. Central authorities gain more control, not less, because you need coordination to keep everything stable. This is the real legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not just bigger wars, but wars run through finance. Violence no longer needed immediate public approval, it needed cash flow. Political resistance could be outlasted. Costs could be postponed indefinitely. Sacrifice could be spread out widely instead of hitting specific people. And this transformed society completely. People who never fought still paid the price. Savings lost value in silence. Wages fell behind prices. Whole generations inherited debts from conflicts they never had any say in. The connection between war and everyday life got weaker. Not because war mattered less, but because its costs were scattered everywhere. This is why modern governments seem so uncheckable. Today, modern warfare isn't limited by how many soldiers you have. It's limited by budgets. Aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, massive logistics networks, these are financial commitments just as much as military ones. And just like in the gunpowder age, the question isn't who fights the best. It's who can afford to keep the fight going. The uncomfortable reality is that restraint rarely comes from morals alone. It comes from cost. When cost gets absorbed, deferred, or hidden through financial tricks, restraint gets weaker. This doesn't mean war is guaranteed to happen. It means war is built into the structure. It lives inside systems designed to make it sustainable. And as long as those systems are in place, the connection between money and violence will stay tight, even when the actual fighting feels worlds away. This is why conversations about debt, inflation, and government spending can never be separated from conversations about power. These aren't just boring economic ideas. They're tools that let governments project force without immediately collapsing. They read the inheritance of a world where gunpowder taught rulers one brutal truth. Whoever controls the money controls how long they can last. Understanding this doesn't mean you have to be cynical. It just means you have to be realistic. So when people wonder why governments borrow so much, why military budgets never seem to go away, why inflation quietly chips away at savings, or why wars feel so disconnected from daily life, the answer isn't in today's news. It's buried centuries back in that moment when technology made violence too expensive to handle casually. Gunpowder didn't just change warfare. It changed what power itself needed to survive. The lesson here isn't that technology is bad or that finance is crooked. It's that systems adapt to the costs they have to deal with. When those costs are huge enough, they reshape everything above them. The institutions, the money, and the lives lived within them. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it echoes with brutal consistency. When technology raises the price of power, money steps in to fill the gap. And once that bridge is built, it almost never gets torn down. If this shifted how you see things, hit that subscribe button. History holds the answers. I'll show you exactly where to find them.